This is what happens to people who speak in tongues. My name is Kamla, I'm 39 years old, married, and the mother of 2. Until recently, I never paid much attention to this whole gift of tongues thing. In fact, if someone started talking about it at church, I'd look away and change the subject. I grew up in a more traditional Christian environment, where this kind of thing was viewed with great skepticism. I'd always heard it was a thing of the past, or worse, just an emotional fabrication. I never imagined that one day I'd share something completely different here. But everything changed one Tuesday morning in a cold hospital room. I was admitted for appendectomy, nothing serious, they said, a simple matter. I will be discharged in 2 or 3 days. I signed the papers, said goodbye to my husband, and was wheeled into the operating room. I remember the anesthesiologist telling me to count backward, 10, 9, 8. Then there was silence, a profound silence, a silence that seemed to swallow me whole, and then, suddenly, the sounds on the monitor began to fade one by one. The last sound I heard was the VIP, which grew fainter and fainter until it stopped. It was at that moment that I knew something had gone terribly wrong. My heart stopped, so did my lungs. The doctors called it a severe allergic reaction to the anesthesia. In other words, I died, for 23 minutes. According to hospital records, there was no detectable heartbeat. But I can assure you that even without a pulse here on Earth, I was more alive than I had ever been anywhere else. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the hospital, there was no white ceiling or fluorescent lights. I was in a place that looked like a garden. But it was as if every leaf, every flower, every sound, everything was vibrating with life. The grass was so green it seemed to glow. The sky, if you can call it that, was blue like a deep ocean, but with no visible sun. The light came from everywhere at once. It was a living presence, a light that seemed to have a personality, and in the midst of that light, he appeared, a man walking toward me. Without words, I knew who he was. It was Jesus. I had never seen his face, but it was as if I had always known him. His eyes were filled with a love that tore me apart inside. I felt a cry that wasn't from sadness or fear. It was the cry of someone who finds what they didn't even know they were looking for. He said my name, Kamla. When I heard it in his voice, I felt as if my heart was dancing with joy. I can't explain it any better. And then he said, I have something important to show you. We walked together toward a place that looked like a field of flowers. The flowers seemed to sing softly, and the trees danced in the wind. He sat on a rock that shone like a diamond and invited me to sit beside him. My children are confused by something I gave them, he said. I didn't know what he was talking about until he brought up this subject I had always avoided. I want to talk to you about the gift of tongues, Jesus told me. I confess that I froze. It seemed so unreal, so strange, that my reaction was one of surprise, almost resistance. But he simply smiled and said, Don't worry, I'll show you what it's really like. It was at that moment that the most profound revelation of my life began. A revelation that would transform not only my faith but also my relationship with God and change everything I had believed until then. Jesus didn't speak in a hurry. Each word seemed to carry a different weight, as if it went straight to my heart. He looked me in the eyes and began, You know when a baby is born and starts making those noises that no one understands? Mom and Dad understand, even when he's just babbling. I nodded, remembering my daughter as a child. It's a love language between the two of us, she continued. When my children speak in tongues, that's exactly a love language between us, they and I. I remained silent. No one had ever explained it to me like this. It made sense. Then Jesus showed me something. It wasn't a dream vision. It was as if I were inside the scene. I saw people praying silently, others whispering words I didn't understand, but something was happening in the invisible. It was as if golden threads were coming out of their mouths and rising straight to heaven. These are perfect prayers, he said. Even when the mind doesn't understand, the heart speaks to me with purity. I saw the Holy Spirit as a living light within these people. He took their words and carried them like perfume to the throne of God. It was beautiful. Jesus then said something that struck me. When someone doesn't know what to ask for, when they are lost, the Holy Spirit prays for them with indescribable groans. I immediately remembered a day when I was so tired, so overwhelmed, that all I could say was, "Lord, help me," and I fell silent. Jesus showed me that night I spoke to him more than I imagined, even without speaking in tongues at the time. Your spirit was already seeking this kind of communion, he explained, but now I want you to understand how this gift can deepen that relationship even further. He began to show me 4 different ways of manifesting this gift. First, I saw an ancient scene like the one in the Bible. People from various nations gathered speaking different languages, but when the disciples began to pray in tongues, each one heard the message in their own language. This is for evangelization, Jesus said. I give you words you don't know, but they reach hearts where not even a translator can reach. Then he showed me a church. A woman was praying in tongues, and a man on the other end was interpreting. This is for corporate edification. He explained, it's as if he uses a single voice and then gives the translation. In the third vision, I saw a woman alone in her home, kneeling speaking softly in tongues. Jesus said, this is for personal use, it's like speaking to me in the language of heaven. The fourth scene was different. I saw a young man pacing, distressed. He began to pray in tongues, but suddenly stopped. He took a deep breath and knew what to do. This is the gift of spiritual guidance, he told me. When the mind doesn't know, but the spirit needs an answer, I speak directly to the heart. I couldn't look away. It was as if the fog of religiosity finally lifted from my mind. Jesus looked at me again. The problem isn't the gift, what did they do with it? He began to show me scenes of confusion, churches that overdid it and others that rejected it completely. My children have been fighting over a gift I gave them to unite them, he said with sadness in his eyes. Some treat this gift as a trophy, others call it foolishness, but everything I give is for edification, not confusion. I felt ashamed. I realized that without even studying, I had already formed an opinion based on fear. Jesus wasn't accusing me, but his truth confronted me with love. He took me by the hand. I don't want you to repeat the mistakes you saw. That's why I brought you here. That struck me like a thunderbolt. I, who had always rejected this topic, was now called to understand and share, and everything he said was so clear, so full of truth, that there was no way to ignore it. My gifts are not to create walls between my children, they are to build bridges between heaven and earth, he said. I didn't know what to say, I could only cry. For the first time in my life, my heart opened to something I had until then called exaggeration, invention, disorder. Jesus led me to another part of the same garden. This time, there was a small lake with water so clear I could see the bottom. He sat on the shore and asked me to do the same. Kamla said, I want to show you something that is hurting my people. As she reached out her hand over the water, the surface began to reveal images like a mirror telling stories. The first scene struck me. It was a full church, of people, but there was competition in the air. A man was praying loudly in tongues, pacing back and forth, looking around to see who was watching him. This is not mine, Jesus said firmly. The scene changed. Now it was a simple prayer meeting with only a few people. A woman began to pray softly in tongues and suddenly fell silent. Another brother interpreted what she had said. It was a message of comfort. The room filled with tears, not hysteria, but reverence. Here, Jesus said, here is fruit, there is order, there is love, this is who I am. He explained to me that the problem was never the gift, the problem is when it is used to boast, to manipulate, or to create division. It saddens me to see people pretending, just to appear spiritual, she said with a look that mixed love and sadness. Jesus showed me something even more delicate. I saw people being taught that if they didn't speak in tongues they wouldn't be saved. I saw children crying, thinking they wouldn't go to heaven because they only spoke Portuguese. Jesus looked at me and said seriously, that's a lie. I don't condition salvation on any gift. Salvation comes by faith, by repentance, by my blood shed on the cross, not by spiritual works. I felt a lump in my throat. How many times, without realizing it, I had stopped loving someone in the church because I didn't see certain gifts in that person. Then he led me to a new scene. It was a woman alone in bed crying. She prayed, but couldn't utter a word. Only incoherent sounds came out of her mouth. "You think she is doing something wrong," Jesus said, "but in reality, he's speaking to me in the most intimate way possible." He smiled tenderly. Many people expect the gift of tongues to be something explosive, dramatic, but it almost always starts small, like someone learning to walk. First they creep, then they crawl, then they begin to take unsteady steps. Over time, the gift grows stronger. The secret is trust. That made me think of what I had seen before. I had always imagined speaking in tongues as something uncontrollable, theatrical, as if a person were entering a state of being out of themselves, but the Jesus showed me something completely different: lightness, intimacy, truth. Kamla, when someone speaks to me in tongues, it's as if they're opening a direct channel between heaven and the heart. The enemy doesn't understand this language, only I and the Spirit understand it. That's why this gift is so precious and so attacked. I felt a mixture of regret and admiration. It was like finding a jewel that I had scorned without even knowing it. He looked me in the eyes and said something I will never forget: "I don't force anyone to receive this gift, but I always reach out. My children need to learn to ask with faith, not with fear." And there, in that moment, I understood that much of my resistance came not from reason, but from fear. Fear of being deceived, of making a fool of myself, of losing control. "I don't want you to lose control," Jesus said. "I want you to trust. I am your Father. If a child asks for bread, the Father doesn't give him stones. I only give him good things." In that moment, my heart opened like never before. Afterward, Jesus led me to a part of the garden where there was a huge tree with deep roots and branches that stretched out like open arms. He invited me to sit under it and said, "I want to show you something about the power that exists in this gift." Then he touched my shoulder and made me see another reality. I saw a woman kneeling at the edge of her bed, praying softly in tongues. As he prayed, a golden light came from his mouth and spread throughout the house. "This prayer protects your family," Jesus explained. "The enemy cannot penetrate this barrier." The image widened. Now I saw other people in different parts of the world: a father praying for his daughter, a young man praying in a corner of the school, a missionary in a dangerous land, all praying in tongues, and around each one he saw a kind of invisible shield. "This gift strengthens the Spirit," Jesus said. "When human words fail, the Spirit continues to intercede. That's why the enemy tries so hard to discredit this gift." That moved me deeply. I had never thought about praying in tongues as a silent but powerful spiritual weapon. Jesus showed me a young woman praying in tongues as she looked out her bedroom window. She appeared fragile on the outside, but enormous strength welled up from within. "When you pray like this, it's like an exercise for the Spirit," she said. "It strengthens your faith, increases your sensitivity to my voice, and prepares you for difficult decisions." Then he showed me a young man unsure of his direction in life. As he prayed in tongues, a sudden clarity came over him as if he had received a direct answer. "This gift also allows me to give you wisdom that goes beyond logic," Jesus explained. What struck me most was when Jesus spoke of spiritual warfare, which many don't even understand. When my children pray in tongues, the enemy becomes confused. He doesn't understand this language. He tries to get close, but he can't penetrate this secret communication between my people and me. I saw shadows trying to get close to a woman facing emotional and spiritual difficulties, but they couldn't touch her. She was protected by that constant prayer, even though she didn't understand everything she was saying. That scene made me think about how many times I've struggled with negative thoughts without knowing how to protect myself. Jesus said something I'd never heard before: "You understand English, Portuguese, and Spanish, but you don't understand the language of heaven." That resonated in my mind. It was a spiritual key that explained so much. We often think it's enough to pray with pretty words, but Jesus showed me that there's a deeper level of intimacy, where even words take a back seat and the Spirit takes over the conversation with God. "I'm not saying that only this kind of prayer works," he explained, "but I want my children to know all the tools I've left them." Then he showed me a pastor. He was a serious man who studied the Bible extensively, but had learned that the gifts had ceased. "His heart is good," Jesus said, but he is losing something because of fear and tradition. I saw that pastor praying silently, asking for wisdom. Little by little, her mind began to open. I don't want my children to ignore my word, but I also don't want them to stop seeking out of fear. That reminded me of myself. For years, I used the Bible to justify my blockage, not realizing that the Bible itself speaks of the gifts as present-day gifts. Jesus was silent for a few seconds. The tree where we were standing swayed gently in the wind. He looked at me tenderly and said, "Kamla, now I need to show you what this gift has done in many churches." Suddenly, the garden disappeared, and I found myself inside a church. It was a lively, noisy service with people shouting, dancing, and speaking in tongues, but something was troubling me. It seemed like people were competing. No one was listening to anyone. There was confusion in the air. "Here, the gift has lost its purpose," Jesus said. "I am not a God of disorder. My gifts are to edify, not to confuse." The scene changed. Now I saw a silent, cold, and almost empty church. The pastor preached, but his voice was dry, lifeless. The congregation stared at the floor with dull eyes, and here Jesus continued. The gift was buried. This church had rejected anything that seemed supernatural for fear of heresy or scandal, but in doing so, they had also set aside the action of the Spirit. I don't want my children to give in to idolatry or contempt for the gifts. Balance is in love. I realized that both scenarios shared a flaw, a lack of discernment and spiritual maturity. Jesus then led me to a simpler place. It was a small room with a few people sitting in a circle praying reverently. One began to pray in tongues, another interpreted. There was no exaggeration, no acting, only faith, only truth. "This is the correct use," she told me. "Everything in order, everything with purpose, everything with love." Those people seemed to grow stronger together. I felt overwhelmed just watching. This is what I want to restore to the churches. The beauty of the gift used wisely. Then I understood that the problem was never the gift itself, but the heart of the recipient. Then Jesus showed me something very personal. A humble-looking woman was praying in tongues inside her home. Around her were photos of her children, grandchildren, and relatives. "He is interceding for all of them," Jesus said. Even without understanding exactly what he is saying, the Spirit is accomplishing things she would never know how to ask for. Then I saw one of her grandchildren being saved from an accident. She doesn't know it, but her prayer in tongues was salvation. That made a lump in my throat. How many grandmothers, how many mothers have sustained generations with prayers they themselves don't understand? Was that when Jesus spoke? Do you understand now why the enemy hates this gift so much? The question hung in the air like an arrow. He hates everything that brings my children closer to me. He hates everything that bears fruit of love, repentance, direction, and spiritual power. He showed me a map of the world with thousands of points of light. Each point represented a person praying in tongues at that very moment. These prayers sustain nations, protect missionaries, strengthen young people, and free homes. I was speechless. I, who had considered this gift strange, now understood how essential it is. Jesus told me, "You have been resisting this because you thought it was something beyond your control," and he was right. I had always been afraid of losing control, of making a fool of myself, of falling into a trap, but there, before him, there was no room for pride. This gift isn't for you to show off, it's not for you to demonstrate to yourself, it's for you to connect. I took a deep breath. Something inside me was cracking like a thick shell that prevented the entry of living water. Then Jesus asked me in his gentle voice, "Do you want this gift that comes from heaven?" I didn't need to think, I could just say, "Yes, I do." The moment I said I do, Jesus placed his hand on my chest. It was as if a wave of warmth ran through my body from within. It wasn't pain, it was like a new life, a gentle but powerful force. I felt tears well up in my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. It was as if my entire soul was cleansed, and then, without thinking or forcing the words, my mouth began to speak, words I had never said before, words that didn't come from my mind, but from a deeper place, and oddly, it didn't fill me with fear, it was peace. As he spoke, Jesus smiled. He didn't interrupt me. He just listened. It was as if we were having a proper conversation, as if I had learned his language without having to take any lessons. "This is just the beginning," he said. "Now that your spirit has opened, I will be able to guide you more clearly." And in that moment, I understood that this gift wasn't an end in itself. It wasn't a medal or a seal of superiority. It was a tool, a bridge, a way to get closer to the one who created me. I didn't want to stop. I felt I was finally complete. Jesus came close and spoke directly to my heart. "You won't use this just for yourself. I chose you to teach, comfort, and correct with love." That scared me a little. "But if I'm just Kamla, who will listen to me?" I thought. He replied firmly, "You were an unbeliever, now you are a witness, and that's what the world needs, someone who speaks the truth, because it has been transformed." It was true. I wasn't a theorist. I was experiencing firsthand what so many people only superficially discussed. It was like going from the classroom directly to the battlefield, and I was ready. Then he showed me something that would change everything. I saw the future. I saw churches reopening through the Spirit. I saw pastors who had once rejected him now seeking him in prayer. I saw young people receiving gifts in their bedrooms, away from the spotlight. I saw simple people praying in tongues in the kitchen, on the bus, in the hospital. I saw revival, but I also saw opposition. I saw mockery, resistance, contempt. I saw people faking gifts to impress. "Not everyone will understand," Jesus said. "Some will imitate, others will resist, but my Spirit will continue to pour out." He looked into my eyes. "You will be one of those who help prepare the way." He also showed me the fruits. I saw families restored. I saw the sick healed. I saw cold hearts comforted. All of this was happening while people were praying in tongues in secret. "The enemy won't be able to stop what I'm doing," he said, "but my children need to be willing to ask, to believe, to receive, willing to let go of the control and trust in myself." I felt a growing responsibility within me. I, who had so often criticized this gift, would now be used by God to demystify it, to teach with humility, to bear witness with the truth. Jesus firmly took my hand. "It's almost time for you to return," he said, "but I want you to take all this seriously. Don't turn what you've experienced into a spectacle, turn it into a calling." That pierced me like an arrow. I realized I couldn't keep it to myself. I had to share it with wisdom, with respect, but without fear. Talk to those who doubt, to those who mock, to those who are confused. "I will be with you. Don't worry about the consequences, just obey." He smiled again. And in that instant, the garden began to crumble before my eyes. When I opened my eyes, the first thing I saw were frightened faces around me, nurses, doctors, my husband crying. The hospital room was filled with beeping machines, bright lights, and a noise that seemed strange after so much time in heavenly silence. A nurse shouted, "He's back." And I realized something extraordinary had happened. "You were dead," one of the doctors said. "We didn't take your vital signs for over 20 minutes. I stared at them, but my heart was still in the garden. The feeling of Jesus' hand was still alive in my chest. In the days that followed, my body slowly recovered, but my soul moved at a different pace. As I took medication and underwent tests, I relived every second of what I had seen, heard, and felt. It was as if a new consciousness had been activated in me. I knew I had returned on a mission, not just to tell a supernatural story, but to correct something that had long distorted the misconception of the gift of tongues. I needed to start with the one who had always accompanied me on this journey, so when I was able to get up, I asked my husband to call our pastor. He came to the hospital, sat next to me, and before I could say anything, he asked, "Did you see anything?" I took a deep breath. "I saw Jesus," I responded, and he spoke to me about the gift of tongues. His face changed. It wasn't contempt, it was apprehension. My pastor had always been a serious, biblical man, and he knew this conversation wouldn't be easy. I told him everything from the moment my heart stopped to the moment my mouth spoke that heavenly language for the first time. He listened attentively and didn't interrupt. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. Kamla said, "I don't know what to think. I'm not going to lie. I've always taught that these gifts no longer exist. "But I know you're not making this up." I saw a conflict in his eyes, faith versus tradition, experience versus doctrine, but I also saw something stirring there, humility, and this tiny crack in the old structure was already a beginning. "Let me pray about this," he asked. "I want to search the word. If it's true, God will confirm it." I didn't want to force anything. I knew that the same patience Jesus had with me, I needed to have with him now. It was the Spirit who would convict me. I just needed to obey. I returned home a few days later, but my life was no longer the same. I would wake up in the middle of the night wanting to pray. These weren't long, memorized words, but an urgency in my spirit, and when I began praying in tongues, I felt as if the air was being purified. Something spiritual was moving, even without any noise. I began to intercede for people I didn't even know. Names and situations came to mind that later, coincidentally or not, were confirmed. It was as if God was using me discreetly, but deliberately, and this only happened when I allowed the Spirit to pray through me. That's when I knew for sure, I needed to share this with more people, but not arrogantly, not to boast, but so that others like me could understand what this gift truly is. I began to write my testimony, then I recorded a simple video on my cell phone, simply sharing my experience, nothing edited, nothing rehearsed, and to my surprise, people began to identify with it, people from different churches, from different places, who felt the same doubt, the same fear as I had before, and so, without meaning to, I began to fulfill what Jesus had asked of me, to bring clarity where there was confusion. The following week, my pastor called me. His voice was different, lighter, curious. "Kamla, do you have a moment to talk calmly?" We arranged a meeting at the church in a private room. He brought his Bible with several notes. He said he had spent nights studying, comparing texts, asking for discernment. I read and reread 1 Corinthians 12:13 and 14, he began, and for the first time, I read it without the filter of fear. Then he paused. "Do you know what moved me the most? The part that says that the gift of tongues is not greater than love, but it is still useful, and if it is useful, why have we abandoned?" That conversation was a turning point. I felt something beginning to change, not only in my pastor's mind, but in the spirit of the church. He didn't change overnight or impose anything, but he did something that Jesus showed me was extremely important. He opened his heart. From there, he called some trusted leaders, shared my experience, and suggested something simple, starting a study group on spiritual gifts. Nothing obligatory, nothing emotional, just the Bible, prayer, and a willingness to listen to the Spirit. And there, something new was born among us. In the first meetings, there were only a few of us, my pastor, me, some young people, and an older couple. We spoke cautiously. Some were afraid of being deceived, others were afraid of getting too emotional, but little by little, the presence of God was within us. We read the Word and then prayed together, and something began to happen. These weren't exaggerated manifestations, but small signs that the Spirit was shaping us. A young woman commented that while praying at home, she felt a strong desire to say something different. Another young man, who had always been afraid to pray in public, began to feel bolder. It was at that moment that one of the leaders, a very reserved man, said something that struck me. "Perhaps the greatest miracle here is not the manifestation of the gift itself, but the destruction of our pride." And that was it. God was breaking down the walls we had built. Fear, rigid doctrine, bad experiences from the past, all of this was being healed. And the funny thing is that, even without publicity, other people began to arrive. People from other churches, from other cities, some curious, others desperate for answers, and what united us was the same search: truth, freedom, the real presence of God. Then my pastor surprised me. One Sunday, he called me before the service. "Today you're going to give your testimony to the church," he said. My heart raced, I trembled, and if you think I'm exaggerating or if you think I'm making this up, I'll take a firm look at myself. Tell the truth, God will take care of the rest. I climbed into the pulpit with weak legs, but a strong heart, and I began to tell about the hospital, about the garden, about Jesus' hand, about the gift I had resisted for years, and how that love broke me and rebuilt me. There were no shouts or spectacles, but there was a reverent silence in the air, people crying, people moved. That morning something happened. It wasn't a revival in the classic sense, but it was an awakening. Several brothers and sisters approached me afterward and said, "I always wanted to understand this better." Others confessed, "I resisted it too. But now I understand." And so, organically, without pressure, the church began to transform. The Spirit taught with patience, as Jesus taught me, and I realized when we spoke with love and true testimony, even the most closed hearts began to open. The gift of tongues was no longer taboo. It was a conversation that could finally happen. Weeks passed, and the small study group became a meeting point for many. It was no longer just about the gift of tongues. It was about hunger, thirst, a desire to know God beyond theory. Some who had strayed from the faith returned with shining eyes. Others, who had always been too religious, began to dismantle their internal structures. I saw people who had never prayed in public before, now on their knees, in silence, sometimes in tongues, sometimes in tears, and the most beautiful thing was realizing that no one was competing, no one was judging. It was as if everyone was learning to breathe again. One night, during one of these meetings, a woman named Doña Lucia began praying in tongues for the first time. He was 74 years old. He had never thought about it before, but that day, during a silent prayer, something welled up inside him. His hands trembled, but his face was at peace. Afterward, he said, "I felt as if I was speaking to God without words." That had a profound impact on me. I saw the promise being fulfilled. "I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh." Age, background, or past didn't matter. God was present and acting with simplicity and depth. Another moving testimony came from a young man named Raphael. Months earlier, he had attempted suicide while battling depression, but his sister took him to one of these meetings. At first, he sat quietly in a corner, distrustful, but one night, after a prayer in tongues led by one of his brothers, he began to cry uncontrollably. He said he felt something break inside him. Days later, he began to pray alone at home, and there, in his inner room, he felt God teaching him to pray again with sounds he didn't understand, but which freed his soul. Today, he's strong and helps other young people with the same problem. What impressed me was how it all happened without any fanfare. There was no hysteria or confusion. People were being healed, delivered, and strengthened in secret, silent, behind the scenes. It was the Spirit working discreetly and deeply. Jesus had told me, "I didn't come to make noise, I came to transform," and I saw it with my own eyes. It wasn't just about speaking in tongues. It was about fruit, love, peace, self-control, people forgiving each other, families reconciling, leaders restored. The gift of tongues was just a door. What lay beyond was a Spirit-filled life. Still, it wasn't all easy. Some resisted, questioned, thought it was an exaggeration, said it was emotionalism. One of them came to me. "Kamla, I respect you, but I still think this whole tongues thing is made up." I smiled. I didn't argue, I didn't try to prove anything. I simply responded, "Okay, just ask God to show it to you. If it's His, He'll confirm it. If not, He'll protect you." Without arguments, without disputes, I learned from Jesus that the truth doesn't need to be forced, it just needs to be lived, and little by little, even the most skeptical began to ask questions with less criticism and more curiosity. At that moment, I understood that my role wasn't to convince anyone, it was to bear witness, speak sincerely, pray for wisdom, and trust that the Holy Spirit is the one who convinces. Some never accepted, others opened up and were deeply impacted, but in every case, I knew I was obeying what Jesus asked of me, to say, show, love, and let Him do the rest. The gift of tongues was no longer a forbidden mystery, it was a living tool that God was restoring with balance, responsibility, and love. One of the most memorable experiences occurred one Sunday night when the church was packed. It was Holy Communion, and all was silent until the pastor did something unusual. After the sermon, he asked for silence and said, "Today, If anyone feels God wants to use their mouth to edify the church, let them speak, and if it's in tongues, may God raise up someone to interpret them. There was a profound silence. For a few seconds, no